You know, you also might ask yourself, you know, why don't people do what's right? It's a good question, because hypothetically they could, and the answer seems to be something like, well, transforming yourself into something that's continually better means continually being swallowed up by something like this, and so it's hard and frightening. So that's why people aren't enlightened, and there's got to be some reason, given that it's hypothetically possible. You know, when you hear people like Joseph Campbell say things like follow your bliss, you know, and so that sounds pretty easy. You want to develop your personality, just do what you love. You know, it's a corruption of Carl Jung's thinking, because Jung would say, well, follow what you're interested in, it'll take you somewhere you really don't want to go, and then maybe you'll learn something. So, and that's a whole different proposition. So, human beings, if you talk about a human being, you tend to use something that's like a story. And when you recount your own being, you tend to use something like a story, and that sort of begs the question, you know, does that mean in fact that your experience is either a story or something like a story? And one of the things Jung said, I really like this, is you should figure out which story you're living, because you're living a story, and it might be a tragedy. And so, you know, you want to find out, because if it's a tragedy, you don't come to a very good end. Another thing Jung said was, this is also worth thinking about, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And so what Jung would say is that if you're living out a tragedy, the tragedy has you. You don't have it. And if you can figure out what the tragedy is that has you in its grip, then you have a fighting chance of escaping from it into a more pleasing plot. But it's no easy thing. You know, so if you're one of those people to whom the same terrible thing keeps happening over and over, after the third time, approximately, you might ask yourself, you know, is this the world or is this me? Alright, so we move from mythological representations into a discussion of both heroic and shamanic initiations. And the reason we're going to talk about shamanic initiations is, first of all, they're a logical next step in moving from the fundamental mythology into depth psychology, but also because initiation processes are processes that archaic people have learned to use to catalyze personality transformation. So for example, a typical initiation tends to be young men who are initiated more often than young women, and the hypothesis there is that Mother Nature initiates young women all on her own, whereas with young men something has to be imposed from a cultural perspective in order to catalyze their transition from childhood dependency and make them independent adults. And that usually involves some relatively terrible experience that I think does two things. One is it helps the person define what actually constitutes terrible. Because you might ask yourself, you know, how worried should you be about something? You know, let's say you wake up in the morning and, you know, you've got you've got an ache in your side. It's like, okay, it wasn't there the night before, so what does that mean? Well, you pulled a muscle, or you're going to die of cancer in 3 months. It's like, you don't know, so how upset should you be? Well, the answer is you don't know. And I think one of the things that initiation processes do to people is calibrate their anxiety systems. So, you know, unless you've been required at some point in your existence to face something that is truly awful without destroying you, maybe you don't know how to calibrate what you should be worried about and what you shouldn't. And it seems to be the implicit theory upon which initiation rituals are predicated, you know, and they tend to reemerge spontaneously. You know, you see them reemerge, for example, in situations like fraternity hazing, you know, or medical residency for that matter, because if you're going to be a medical resident, you can be completely assured that you're going to be tortured to death for 2 years. So, and when you come out of that, you won't be the same person that you were when you went in. And it isn't necessarily the case that that will be, you know, that you'll be better, but that's a different issue. So, I want to talk about the structure of shamanic and heroic initiations, partly to further our understanding of personality transformation, but also partly to give you an idea of the body of the relationship between the symbolic realm and the day-to-day realm prior to the emergence of psychoanalysis. Because when psychoanalysis emerged in the first part of the 20th century, the psychoanalysts, mostly Freud and Jung, discovered what you might regard as a symbolic realm. They associated it with within. So the symbolic realm, in terms of your experience, might be what you dream at night. You know how bizarre dreams are. You know, and there's debate about whether they're interpretable. I'd say some people's dreams are interpretable and some people's aren't, in my experience. But it's the dream realm, for example, is very peculiar because obviously you experience it. It's quasi-coherent in that when you wake up and you remember it, you can remember it. First of all, it's not random. It's not like white noise on a blank screen. You know, it has characters. They're doing things. Although there are dynamic jumps usually in the narrative structure that make it difficult to understand. There are chunks of it that are clearly comprehensible, you know, and that seem to have the same quality, roughly speaking, as something cinematic. Things transform in peculiar ways in dreams. The normal laws of physics are often suspended in one way or another, so people frequently dream of flying, for example. And most peculiarly, dreams seem to happen to you. You know, because you say, well, I dreamt last night, but that doesn't generally mean that, you know, you decided which movie to play in your head, so to speak. It seems when you're dreaming that things happen to you in your dream that are like the things that happen to you in regular life, in that they happen. You don't make them happen. So in a dream, you're the subject of uncontrollable forces in some sense, just as you are in waking life. It's like, okay, well, who in the world is dreaming? You know, it's not the ego, obviously, because you can't control it unless you happen to be a lucid dreamer. You know, some people can become conscious during their dreams and exercise a certain degree of control over the contents. Although it's a relatively undeveloped skill. It's not particularly rare. How many of you have had lucid dreams? It's very much more common among women, generally, for reasons we don't really understand. So, but most of the time, a dream is something in which you're embedded. It's like, what's dreaming exactly? You know, Jung would say, well, the world is dreaming inside of you. It's nature dreaming inside of you. It's a natural phenomena, and it has the same kind of meaning that any other natural phenomena has, which is what meaning you can discover that turns out to be useful. So there's a relationship between that internal set of processes, you know, that deeply symbolic set of processes, and the kind of rituals and symbols that are used in archaic ceremonies like heroic and shamanic initiations. And so that's partly why I want to tell you about them. It also helps you understand, I think, a little more deeply, the price that you have to pay in order to transform. Because the rule in most archaic cultures is that to transform a male adolescent into a man requires dismantling the childhood personality, often rather brutally, and replacing it with something that's new. And so, you know, you might think, well, perhaps the brutality isn't necessary, but it's hard to say what's necessary. You know, there's a rule in psychological therapy, and the rule is, if you want to improve, you have to identify what it is that you're afraid of that's stopping you, and then you have to confront it. And you have to do that voluntarily. It's the primary rule, you might say. It's the primary rule of psychotherapy. You're going somewhere, there are impediments. The impediments make you afraid. Because you're afraid, you stop progressing. So what do you have to do? You have to face the things that are stopping you voluntarily. You know, and that's part of the heroic, that's actually part of standard hero narratives, which is face the thing that you're afraid of. That's why, for example, in The Hobbit, Frodo? It's Frodo, isn't it? Bilbo's the second one. Yeah, Frodo has to face the dragon, and the dragon hoards gold. Bilbo, sorry, well thank you, yes, that is what I was asking. Bilbo has to face the dragon, and the dragon hoards gold. It's like, what the hell does a giant reptile need with gold? Well, the answer to that in part is that the giant reptile represents that which you are afraid of, and the treasure that it sits on represents what you gain if you conquer what you're afraid of. And it's an archetypal story in some sense because you can't invent a more frightening story than that, a more frightening and richer story. There's nothing more frightening than a dragon, roughly speaking, and there's nothing more valuable than a hoard of gold, and that's partly what makes the story archetypal, right? It's taken the phenomena and extended them to the point of maximum return, in some sense.